So like I mentioned, my name's Trent Roberts. I'm a soil fertility specialist with the University of Arkansas Division of Agriculture. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is some research that we've really just started. And the basis of this is to compare kind of overall yield and economics of cover crop systems to double cropped wheat soybean systems. And like I said, I think this was producer driven in a lot of ways from both sides, both the people who are interested in cover crops, and then I think a lot of producers who maybe weren't sold on cover crops but wanted kind of another angle to take a look at it. So just as a topical outline, I'm going to talk a little bit about cover crop adoption and then winter wheat acreage, costs of cover crops, costs of winter wheat production, and then really kind of wrap it all up with this idea of how the two systems compare to one another. So if you think about the cover crops that are specifically for soybean or that would work best prior to soybean in a crop rotation, what you're really interested in with those cover crops is high biomass and low input cost. And those are typically going to be our winter cereal type cover crops. I always try to remind people, like, if you're getting into cover crops, you want to have a clear goal about what you're trying to accomplish. There are a lot of different benefits that can be gained from cover crops, but you need to have some idea. For this field, for this crop rotation, I want weed suppression. For this field, for this crop rotation, I want moisture retention to reduce irrigation. And I think the more that you can have clearly defined goals for the purpose of that cover crop, the more successful that you'll be. The winter cereals that I think are ideal for Arkansas growing production, climatic conditions, and probably really the whole Mid-South are cereal, rye, triticale, and I put oats here and listed either black seeded or bob oats. We've tested both of these, and it really just kind of comes down to your preference. And then the past couple years, we've looked at barley. The one thing that I'll say is on this list, if I were to rank them, black seeded oats would be my top winter cereal cover crop. Part of the reason is I think they do very well in poorly drained soils. And if you ever look at a black oat versus a bob oat or these other winter cereals, they have really, really wide leaf blades. So they canopy very quick. They do tend to stay a lot shorter, and at least when we're planting either green or into dry, I think it's a lot easier to plant into that biomass than a lot of the others. I don't have as much success with like cereal rye, triticale, or winter wheat planting into, especially when it's dry, just because that residue gets very stringy. It's a little bit harder to cut. Anywhere you're growing rice, I think the black seeded oat is better suited for those poorly drained soil conditions. So winter wheat acreage in Arkansas. When I first moved to Arkansas, there was consistently over 1 million acres of winter wheat planted annually. And then over time, we've just seen, a steady drop, a little bit of a bump, but really over the past few years, consistently low winter wheat acreage. I think this past year they predicted 150,000 acres of winter wheat might get planted. With the fall conditions, I would guess there's probably less than 50,000 acres that actually got planted last fall. And so when you start talking about what is driving this, I think price of winter wheat is part of that, but I think the biggest issue is most producers will tell you the amount of money that they lose in the resultant soybean yield drop is more than they get from the winter wheat that they harvest. So the low value of winter wheat and their yield loss on soybean is just too much to handle. So they would prefer not to grow wheat at all and plant the soybeans earlier. They feel like they can make more money doing that. So one thing that we wanted to do, and kind of the purpose of this study, is, well, a double crop wheat soybean system in a lot of ways is kind of similar to a cover cropping system in the sense that you have winter cover, out there during the winter to get those benefits. The only difference really is the time that you're planting the soybeans, right? If you're doing a cover crop system, you can plant those soybean a lot earlier. If you're doing a double crop system, you're really restricted until after the wheat comes off before you can plant your soybean. So just some general comparisons. If you think about cover crops, depending on when and how you implement them, you can have some land preparation, you're going to have some seed cost, and then termination, which within this project, we did all chemical termination. If you think about winter wheat production, you're going to have land prep, seed cost, but you're also going to have fertilization, you're going to have herbicides, fungicides, and then the harvest cost. So those are some of the differences that we'll be comparing. I think one of the big things that I try to tell people is that if you're producing good crop yields, cover crops aren't always going to give you this big yield increase, right? So if you're producing 70, 80 bushel soybeans, I wouldn't expect you to get a big yield bump from implementing cover crops. Now, if you're cutting 30, 40 bushel soybeans, then I think cover crops can give you kind of a yield bump. And so that's one thing that we wanted to address in this particular study. So for the trial locations, we kind of did one up here in the Arkansas River Valley, Pine Tree Research Station, and then the Rower Research Station in southeast Arkansas. So this would be fairly close to like where Lane and his family farms. And they're going to all be silt loam soils. I wouldn't call them rice soils, but they're definitely not like well-drained cotton soils. They're kind of somewhere in the middle. So for our cover crop treatments, we wanted to kind of, test a lot of different things that are being planted or promoted as far as cover crop rotations. So you can see here we have the cover crop species, we have the drilled seeding rate for those, and then the seed cost per acre. So obviously, when we're looking at these winter cereals and their associated seeding rates, you can see they tend to be the cheaper in terms of establishment or seed cost. This soybean blend is a mix of cereal rye, 7-top turnip, and crimson clover. And so part of the reason we included this one is we felt like there were a lot of producers that were using this, and that it was being promoted in front of soybean specifically. We included Austrian winter pea just because in a lot of our cereal or cash crops, we would recommend Austrian winter pea in front of corn, rice. So we wanted to include that treatment just from the standpoint of if they planted Austrian winter pea and then switched from rice to soybean or corn to soybean, what effect that might have. This is a blend that we promote quite a bit, a mix of Austrian winter pea and black seeded oat, and we kind of switch the ratio of the blend depending on if you're going into rice or going into soybean. So going into soybean, we plant heavier with the black seeded oat and lower with the Austrian winter pea, and then we reverse it if we're going into a cereal cash crop. And then this would be our winter wheat for grain for our double crop system. That's the associated seeding rate that's recommended at Arkansas and the seed cost. And then we had a fallow treatment kind of just as a baseline. So just for kind of some upkeeping and how we manage these trials, the cover crops and the wheat were all no-till drilled for our fall establishment. All of our cover crop treatments were terminated near early heading of the winter cereals, and we did that using chemical termination. The soybean were no-till drilled into the residue, and so in these studies we tried to do, destruction of that green bridge as best we could. So chemical termination, then we waited until the residue was dry before we planted. The wheat was harvested for grain, and then the soybean was no-till drilled into that stubble following wheat harvest. So this is an example of the yields for the vegetable substation. So this would have been in the Arkansas River Valley. And if you look here, you can see statistically there was basically no difference across any of our winter cover crop treatments. There were some slight numerical differences, but if you look, all these yields were within about 6 bushels of one another. The one thing that did stand out was there was a significant drop in the soybean yield when we followed winter wheat. And so, part of this difference is attributed to that difference in planting date. So the fact that we planted these soybeans after that winter wheat harvest is probably where we're getting, the biggest contribution to that particular yield drop. When we moved to the rower research station, one thing that I found that was very unique about this particular situation is, once again, we basically got no differences across our winter cover crop treatments, but our soybeans following winter wheat also did very well. And so I attribute part of this to the fact that it is further south. The soybean that we planted in all these trials was a 4.4 maturity group. And so I think, the wheat coming off earlier at this particular location, combined with the fact that it does stay warmer and you have a little bit longer growing season in the south, is part of why the soybean following wheat did so much better at this particular location than the others. The last one, this was the only location where the soybean yield was actually different across the covered crop treatments. And so if you look, the soybean following barley and the soybean following the blend of Austrian winter pea and black oats, those two yields were significantly greater than the fallow, and they were significantly greater than the wheat, or the soybean following the wheat for grain. So in our next couple of slides, these two treatments will have different numbers that are associated with that statistically higher yield that we got out of those particular treatments.
Did you do anything differently from a weed control standpoint on your fallow versus any of your cover crops?
No, sir, we didn't. And so what we tried to do was a fully recommended herbicide program, and basically Dr. Jason Norsworthy wrote that for us. So we weren't cutting any herbicides out of the cover crops treatments or anything like that. We didn't want that to be a factor in the study.
I had one other question too. On your wheat harvesting, did you harvest that grain all at the same height? Because that does make a difference on yield as well.
Yeah, so with our plot combine, we pretty much cut it all at the same height. The wheat study, we actually had a nitrogen rate study within that, so the wheat itself was different heights, but it was all harvested at the same height. And just to kind of lead into this next slide, I think one issue that we'll have when we start talking about returns per acre is the pine tree location definitely last year had frost damage. And so our wheat yield in that particular treatment was less than it typically would have been, so that influenced some of our returns. But what I wanted to do here was just trying to give a relative cost for each of these treatments. And so if you can see here, I've added a column for herbicide cost. And this is basically a recommendation or a cost associated with the recommendation for herbicide termination for these specific blends. So when you look at our winter cereals here, that's basically the cost of glyphosate per acre, because the winter cereals can fairly easily be terminated with glyphosate. When you start getting into these blends that contain both broadleafs and winter cereals, the herbicide cost goes up quite a bit, and the reason for that is, at least in Arkansas, the recommendation for herbicide termination on those is a combination of paraquat and metribuzin. And that's why we're seeing this big jump in that herbicide cost. The reason that that's recommended is the weed scientists feel that that's the best way to get complete kill with one pass of herbicide for those cover crop blends. The winter wheat for grain, if you look at this herbicide cost, that's the combination of herbicide in the wheat crop as well as the herbicide in the soybean crop. And then the fallow, basically I put a range here, and that's just to try to encompass different burn down programs that producers might use following winter fallow. So what I wanted to try to do here is basically the total return for each treatment. And the way that we tried to approach this was just the variable costs that were associated with what we were comparing. So I've got the total cost from the previous slide here, and then I have basically the associated yields and the return from what those yields were. So if you look at pine tree, our barley treatment and our Austrian winter pea and black oat treatment, they had statistically higher yields. And so those yields were actually determined and calculated in this number. But like at VSS, since all of these cover crop treatments had statistically no difference in yield, we took the average to calculate the return for all of those treatments. So starting with the pine tree location, you can see in the fallow treatment, this was basically our return to inputs. You can see that in our winter wheat for grain or our double crop system, we actually lost money. And I attribute a big portion of that to the low wheat yield from some of the frost damage and the significant decrease in soybean yield due to the late planting date. You can see here almost all of our cover crop treatments have a significantly higher return on investment just based on those variable costs that we changed in the study. When you go to the vegetable substation, you can see here the blue lupin had significantly lower return than the fallow, and then we had really poor return in our double crop system. But basically all of these cover crop treatments were similar or greater return than the fallow. And then at the Rower Research Station, the numbers are going to change a little bit, but our double crop system at that particular location actually performed the best. And that was because, right, there was no difference in the soybean yield in the double crop system, and, right, we were cutting 70 bushel wheat in that particular location. So the high wheat yield plus no difference in the soybean yield is what gives us this high return in that particular production situation. And then you can see once again a lot of our cover crop stuff still has a higher return. So just to break this down, if you look, the PTRS location, cover crops tended to return about $75 per acre more than the fallow. And once again, I attribute a lot of that to the increased yield associated with those. Double crop soybean tended to return, negative $50 per acre, less than the fallow. And if you looked at the cover crop beans, you lost about $125 per acre on those. At the vegetable substation, across the board, cover crops tended to return about $20 more per acre than the fallow. Double crop, you lost about $185 versus the fallow, and about $205 compared to the cover crop beans. At the rower location, once again, cover crops were about a $20 per acre advantage over the fallow. Our double crop soybean tended to return about $226 more per acre than the fallow, and even greater than the cover crop due to that maintenance in soybean yield and then the added benefit of the wheat yield on top of that. So, $20 per acre more than the fallow. When you look back at these costs of the fallow, I think one of the biggest things that a lot of people miss when we go from a traditional soybean system into a cover crop soybean is the cost associated with tillage. And so what we tried to do in our study was capture that cost savings that we get when we reduce or eliminate tillage from the production system. And so to me, when I start working with farmers who are trying to get into cover crops, I think the hardest part about it for them is the no-till production aspect. Because I did a lot of demos the past 3 or 4 years, and they loved the idea until I told them, well, you can't till. And then it's like when I told them, hey, you're going to have to go no-till in this demo, that's when I lost everybody. And so we basically went through and I worked with
Can we start a 60-day rehab program for them?
well, I don't know who's going to start it. Maybe you need to be my name's Robbie, and
I can't tell anymore.
you can give out little tokens. But the economists in Arkansas production systems, they feel like you can gain or you can save anywhere from $30 to $50 per acre in savings by going to no-till. And so that would include labor cost, fuel cost, maintenance, and then equipment depreciation. And so when you think about a lot of those, we'll say monetary returns or gains in the cover crop system, you're basically getting this gain just by going to no-till when you do the cover crops. So then any yield benefits or things like that you get on top is just kind of gravy. But I think this is one thing that we probably need to promote a lot more. I think the flip side of that is you can't really be successful with cover crops if you don't also implement no-till. And so the fact that those two go together, it just increases kind of your return on investment. This is a study that we're hoping to keep doing for a few more years just to get an overall picture of kind of our long-term savings.
What about, and I know it'd be a longer term, but even a bigger picture that a lot doesn't come in is a lot of guys are cleaning, even in a precision leveled situation, they're cleaning their ditches out every 5 to 6 years. Dan showed a slide a while ago, tillage in the fall and put in, first year established covers, 900 pounds of soil loss per acre on one side versus 100 pounds on the other side, or 100 and something. And I said, I want to see that next year where there's cover behind cover, how much soil loss is. There's got to be a value to that soil loss figured in here somewhere too, like I said, it gets hidden that people don't give.
Well, and so, people have tried to put values on, we're supposed to lose 3 tons per acre of topsoil in Arkansas annually. Well, how do you put a price tag on that? You can calculate the value of the organic matter, you can calculate the value of, the land. But I guess what bothers me more than anything is a lot of the producers that I approached in the demonstration project weren't seeing the forest for the trees, in the sense of, I would tell them erosion is the primary problem with surface water in Arkansas. And they would say, well, my fields are flat, I don't have an erosion problem.
There's a track hoe cleaning out.
But at the same time, they've got a track hoe cleaning out all their drainage ditches. And so it's kind of like, well, if you don't have an erosion problem, why are you cleaning out your drainage ditch every year? And so, like I said, I think they get so focused on one aspect, and they don't really see the entire effect that their production practices are having. But I think this is at least kind of the first step in the right direction. And I had to put this in here. It seems like every time we go to check on our cover crops, we get stuck. But I'll try to answer any more questions that you all might have.
Nutrition loss is the other thing you got in the ditch over the side of the field.
Yeah, and I guess it's kind of hard for me to get on a soapbox about nutrients, because at least in Arkansas, that hasn't been identified as a major problem. When you look at Arkansas water quality, it's all erosion. So their big focus from Natural Resource Commission and ADEQ is sedimentation and turbidity. So their focus is we need cover crops to prevent erosion. If you look at the majority of our freshwater systems in Arkansas, nutrients aren't a major concern right now.
As the world becomes more irrigated and as we use the high pH water, in time, I see, even in our, down in my part of the world, a lot of pHs are going up.
Well, and so I
Creating
think,
other problems too as well.
I think cover crops in these areas where we're having to use high pH irrigation water could help, because as you go to no-till and you have all that residue and you have that soil organic matter, that actually has a net acidic effect. And so I think it'll help offset a lot of that. You know, the problem that we have is, you know, our longest continuous cover crop study in Arkansas has only been going about 4 years. So we don't have like this long-term data to draw off of to really make any conclusions. And when you go to the long-term cover crop studies in the South, they're non-irrigated, they're on completely different soils. So everything we've got is so short-term that we can't really make these, you know, long-term projections on what's gonna happen.